Hello, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for taking your time to attend this official launch of the CPEC Institute and the release of our first research report. My name is Andy Shi and I'm the Executive Director of CPEC. I'm situated in Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haida and the Shawnee, and the Wendat peoples. I'm honored to host today's event. In our audience, we have people from across Canada and from academia, government, community, and elected office. I want to extend my warmest welcome to you all. I would also like to especially acknowledge the presence of our wonderful local MP, Ms. Jean Ip, Member of Parliament for Scarborough Agincourt, who is here today on behalf of Minister Bradley Chagger, the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth of Canada. For those of you who are not familiar with CPEC, let me briefly tell you who we are, what we do, and why CPEC Institute. We are a nonprofit organization with over 30,000 members who are internationally trained professionals. We have been assisting immigrant professionals and racialized youth for almost 30 years. With their career and professional development. We have also been an advocate on issues important to the communities we serve. A decade and a half ago, we championed the cause of fair access to professions, which led to a new piece of legislation, the Ontario Fair Access to Regulated Professions Act. In the latest round of strategic planning, that took place in 2018 to 2019, we adopted a new direction and resolved to establish a CPEC Institute to do more research-based advocacy because we recognize there are serious systemic issues in our society. Issues such as equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI for short, issues of racism and hate, issues in education where Eurocentric curriculum leave off the histories and contributions of Chinese Canadians, Blacks, Indigenous people, and others, which is the root cause of systemic racism. There are also issues specific to the Chinese community, such as youth mental health, intergenerational, and intercultural conflicts. Last year, CPEC Institute was incorporated as an independent research, education, and training organization that provides research-based support for the understanding and elimination of systemic barriers to equity, diversity, and inclusion in Canadian society, and for addressing specific issues concerning the well-being of Chinese Canadians. The research we are going to present today is the first study we have conducted under CPEC Institute. Not long after we started this project, COVID-19 hit Canada and the world. This coronavirus unleashed another virus and a shadow pandemic, anti-Asian racism. Many Chinese and East Asian Canadians have been assaulted, verbally attacked, spat on, yelled at, and treated with all kinds of hostile behaviors. Hate crimes and hate incidents went through the roof. Our community was traumatized, and we felt a responsibility to respond. We have organized about 15 educational webinars, organized awareness campaigns. We called on all levels of government to act, and we've seen some progress at all levels. For the first time in history, the federal government now has a definition for anti-Asian racism. In Ontario, last year, at the height of the anti-Asian racism, we were excluded from applying for an anti-racism grant. This year, things changed. The application package has a few important words, include anti-Asian racism. So there is progress, although very, very slow. Much remains to be done. Raising awareness alone is a daunting task. Until this day, there are still journalists asking us if anti-Asian racism really exists. So we have a lot to do, and we hope people will support us on this undertaking. I'm very grateful to acknowledge that we have received donations from a wide range of individuals and corporations across Canada. The most inspiring support was from a high school class in Ottawa. The students raised funds to support our work, which was tremendously encouraging. I believe people support us because they share our vision, and that is an inclusive Canada, a Canadian society where people of all backgrounds are equally respected and equitably represented. With that, I'd like to call upon Dr. T. Wang, the president of CPAC, to make some opening remarks. T.
Hey, honored guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of CPAC, let me first extend a sincere thank you to all of you for being here to attend this official launch of CPAC Institute and the release of its first research report. For almost 30 years, as just our ED mentioned, CPAC has been serving our community of internationally trained and educated professionals and youth with their cultural integration, skills upgrading, professional development, and leadership enhancement. We have also been a strong advocate for credential recognition, fair access to professions, and racial justice. So, it is a natural development for CPAC that in our latest strategic planning, we adopted a plan 2 years ago that we resolved to create CPAC Institute, dedicated to research, education, training on issues important to Chinese and racialized communities. Our main objective is to provide fact-based research support for addressing systemic barriers to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and issues that are affecting the well-being of our community members. CPAC Institute was incorporated and started its work in 2020, which is last year. Its first main initiative was a research study on Chinese representation in senior leaderships across all major sectors in Greater Toronto area. This is the first time such a focused study has been done, and you will see the result very shortly today. We hope that the findings of this research will raise the awareness of the severe underrepresentation of Chinese Canadians in senior leadership, increase understanding of the root causes, and catalyze actions to address this racial inequity with meaningful policies and practices. I want to take this opportunity to sincerely thank all the corporations and the individuals who have donated to support the CPAC's advocacy initiatives. Your kind support is precious to us. Our first research project was done without any government funding. CPAC Institute's operation will depend on your continuing study and your continuing support. And with your support, we will carry out more and more such projects to facilitate our society's progresses in racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, and help to build a fair and inclusive Canada. Thank you.
Well, thank you, T. Next on our program is a guest speaker, a thought leader, and a diversity champion. For those of you in the Canadian EDI space, you have probably heard the name Wendy Sucre. Dr. Wendy Sucre is the founder of the Diversity Institute at Rice University. She has been a personal inspiration for me, and the work she and her team have done has inspired our research. So it's fitting to have her here today to make some remarks about the subject matter as an issue expert. Wendy has a long bio and a list of awards and honors that would take forever for me to read, so I will just mention a few of her distinctions. She was the former Vice President of Research and Innovation at Ryerson and is the Academic Director of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and Research Lead of the Future Skills Center. Beyond diversity studies, Wendy is one of Canada's leading experts in disruptive technologies and innovation processes, and is the co-author of the bestseller, Innovation Nation, Canadian Leadership from Java to Jurassic Park. Wendy has been recognized as one of the 100 most powerful women by WXN, one of the International Women's Forum 2020 Women Who Make a Difference, a woman of influence, and one of the 100 alumni who shaped the century by the University of Toronto. Without further ado, I call upon Dr. Wendy Sucre. Wendy.
Thanks so much, Andy. And whenever people read my bio, it just makes me feel old. So I was delighted to see this work done, and I do have a quick slideshow that I would like to share, if I can, with you, just to set a bit of context about why I think this research is so very important. Andy, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, great. So I will try to be very brief, but I do think it's important to understand how important this work is, because we know, quite apart from being committed to equality and human rights and what's fair and being opposed to hate and discrimination and racism, we also know that increasing diversity is critically important to ensure that we have access to the best and the brightest from around the world, that we respond to the needs of increasingly diverse communities, that we encourage innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship. Newcomers are more likely to be entrepreneurs than people who are Canadian born. We also know that doing a good job on diversity and inclusion increases satisfaction of employees, and that helps improve performance. And we know that if you don't get this right, and we've had some very high profile examples of organizations not getting this right, you have huge legal and reputational costs. We also know that the impact of COVID has been uneven and affected different people in different ways. And we recently did a study on mental health issues with Environics. And what is worth noting here is that when you look at studies around perceptions of mental health based on racial identity, after COVID, Chinese Canadians have the lowest reported rates of excellent or very good mental health, the biggest drop that we have seen in any ethnic group, including Indigenous people. And what I would say is this is a story that has not been adequately told. So when we've looked at racism in the past, we've tended to focus on some groups. And I think only since COVID has more and more of the attention been focused, not just on the experience of people who identify as Chinese as a result of COVID, and we all know about those cases, but the long-standing history of racism, where people who are Chinese are finally telling the stories of what they have endured over years. And I think there are cultural reasons, perhaps, that explain why this has never been brought to our attention in the same way that, say, anti-Black racism has been addressed. But we know for sure that anti-Asian racism, and particularly racism against people who are Chinese or even look Chinese, is not only on the rise, but has been a problem for many years. Diversity Leads, which Andy mentioned, was in some ways the inspiration for this study, at least from the point of view of the methods, looks across sectors, across cities, and historically we have looked at women, racialized or visible minorities, and then last year we pulled out people who identified as Black. And what we showed, which was very important, is that women are underrepresented on boards and in leadership roles across the country. But people who are racialized or visible minorities are even more underrepresented. And in a city like Toronto, where half the population is racialized and half the population is white women outnumber racialized women by 13-1 on corporate boards. So we have a lot of evidence that there are issues. And increasingly, we also recognize the differences occur across sectors. The differences occur within companies. And we have to recognize that if you have some companies that have 20% racialized people on their boards and others, most of them, that have none, the problem is not the pool of people. The problem is the processes that those organizations use. So look, for example, at Vancouver, which has a very high proportion of racialized people in the population. In fact, they are now the majority. 71% of corporate boards are only white people. So when we think about the way forward, there are no simple solutions to complex problems. We have to counter stereotypes. We have to challenge racism in all its forms. We have to look at issues like our immigration processes. When we're looking at inclusion for women, we have to look at parental leave, and we have to look at childcare. Rocco Rossi, who's the head of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, said, childcare is not a women's issue, it's an economic issue. And we have to recognize that many of these issues around diversity and inclusion are economic issues. They're not just the right thing to do. We have legislation. Increasingly, we have voluntary codes like the 50-30 challenge, which I would encourage you all to look at. And what the 50-30 challenge is suggesting is that companies and organizations should sign up to aspire to gender parity and increased representation on their boards. We have to look at organizational practices, not just human resources and representation and leadership or organizational culture, but we have to dig right in to procurement, to product design, to service delivery. We have to mainstream diversity and inclusion through the value chain. We have to set targets and we have to be accountable. And at the end of the day, all of this comes down to individuals becoming more aware both of their privilege and of the experiences of others. I had a very sad conversation with a politician recently, and I said that a Chinese woman that I knew was afraid to go out walking in her neighborhood in one of the communities outside of Toronto. And his response, he was an older white man, was to say, "She's wrong. How can she be so silly? My wife and I go walking every night. We're not afraid." And that to me was the quintessential problem of getting people to understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. So it's very important that we all work together, that we not be bystanders, that men support women, that white people support those who are racialized, that we all work on Indigenous truth and reconciliation and creating a more inclusive environment. And this study is an important part of that process. So I'm very grateful to CPAC for undertaking this, and I will hand the floor back to Andy.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy. That's a wonderful setup for our next set of the presentation. It provides such a nice context for our study. And our study is in two phases. The first phase is a quantitative study, and the second phase was a qualitative study. And I would like to ask our research associate, Kate Zhang, to present the quantitative results. And Kate is the primary investigator of this study. She has a PhD in equity studies from Western University and the very first researcher of the CPAC Institute. Kate.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you the findings of our research and also excited to the conversations we will have afterwards. We started this study in January 2020. It was initially motivated by the significant lack of data about the representation and experiences of Chinese Canadian leadership. While in the past 2 decades, quite a number of studies have examined Black, Indigenous, and people of color in senior leadership, little research has been done to look at the situation of Asians, or specifically Chinese Canadians, the largest racialized group in Canada, who have been portrayed as a model minority, but have historically been targets of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. We therefore believe such a study is urgently needed. It can help to measure to what extent are Chinese Canadians underrepresented in leadership roles, what barriers and constraints they have experienced on their leadership journey, and what could be done at the organizational and government levels to enhance workplace equity, diversity, and inclusion. So to achieve this end, we collected both the quantitative and qualitative data. Now let's start with the findings of our quantitative analysis. So in this phase of the study, we examined over 10,000 senior leaders in the largest GTA-based organizations across 8 sectors. We looked at the public service sector, the judicial sector, the largest GTA-based corporations, the largest hospitals, and other core healthcare organizations, educational institutions, charitable organizations, Ontario and Toronto agencies, boards, and commissions, and elected office. So in this report, Tier 1 leaders in most cases refer to the board of directors and the most senior management executives as defined by each organization. We also collect the data of Tier 2 leadership in 3 sectors, and thereby to look at whether a leadership pipeline has been properly developed. The representation of Chinese Canadian women was examined as well to shed light on the intersections of gender, race, and other factors that have created additional challenges for women of color in their advancements to senior leadership. So for the public service sector, we identified Chinese Canadians among municipal senior leaders, police regional senior leaders, Government of Ontario senior officials, and the federal government senior officials working in the GTA. Right over here, we see the percentage of Chinese Canadians among the Tier 1 municipal leaders is only 3.39%, much lower when compared with their population, which is 11.1%. In the police sector, we examined 23 chiefs and deputy chiefs in 5 regional police services, and we found only 1 deputy chief is of Chinese descent, which constitutes 4.35% of the leaders. Among the federal and Ontario government senior officials, Chinese Canadians' representation is extremely low. It is worrisome that in the Tier 2 leadership, the proportion of Chinese Canadians is even lower than in Tier 1 in a number of subsectors, which means there has been severely underdevelopment of an inclusive leadership pipeline. For example, in the police sector, as I just mentioned, there's 1 associate chief in Tier 1 leadership, but among the 76 superintendents, none is of Chinese descent. Chinese women are non-existent in the top leadership, except for only 1 person in the municipal service subsector. Their representation improves in Tier 2 leadership, which is 1.45, and surpasses men, which is only 0.51. Although the overall numbers remain dismal for both Chinese men and women. So now let's look at the judicial sector. In this sector, we examined the judges and the deputy judges of Court of Appeal for Ontario, Superior Court of Justice in the Central East, Central West, and the Toronto regions, and also the Ontario Court of Justice in the Central East, Central West, and Toronto regions. So from the chart, we can see Chinese Canadians are non-existent in the Court of Appeal for Ontario. Over the 190 judges of the Superior Court of Justice, only 1 judge is of Chinese descent, but she has been half retired since 2015. Of the 183 judges of the Ontario Court of Justice, only 2, or 1.1%, are of Chinese descent. 2 of the 3 judges identified as Chinese Canadians are women. We also examined 155 deputy judges in the small claim court and found only 3, or 1.94%, are of Chinese descent. All of them are women. So in the corporate sector, we examined the largest 183 GTA-based corporations ranked by the Financial Post magazine, and the 4 big accounting firms, and the largest 7 Canadian law firms. They are all based in the GTA. Among the largest accounting and law firms senior sectors, Chinese Canadians are non-existent. In the largest GTA-based corporations, they only constitute 1.14 of the total senior leaders. Women's representation is even lower. They hold the same board positions as men, but represent significantly lower than men in senior executive positions. So in the core healthcare sector, we looked at 32 largest GTA-based organizations that have 300 or more full-time employees. We examined over 800 senior leaders. Chinese Canadians hold 2.54% of the board positions and 4.26% of the senior executive positions. Their overall representation is slightly over 3%. Chinese Canadian women represent less than men on both the board and the senior executive teams. For the education sector, we examined both the largest universities and colleges and all the district school boards in the GTA. In the post-secondary institutions, again, the proportion of Chinese Canadian leaders is very low, especially among the senior executives. In Tier 2 leadership, we examined 195 leaders. Only 3, or 1.54%, are of Chinese descent. Chinese Canadian women represent slightly higher than men on boards, but are completely missing in the executive positions. At the Tier 2 level, only one position is held by a Chinese Canadian woman. Among the school district board leaders, which include the directors, associate directors, superintendents, and equivalents, only 6 out of 203 are Chinese Canadians, and none of them are directors or associate directors. Women represent lower than men in both public and Catholic school boards. So in the charitable sector, the situation is better when compared with corporate sector, but the overall representation is still very low. Only 2.59% of the senior leaders are of Chinese descent. Women's representation in board positions is higher than that of men's, but their representation in senior executives is significantly lower. We examined 228 senior executives and only found one Chinese Canadian woman. Now let's look at the Ontario and Toronto agencies, boards, and commissions. We examined over 2,000 appointments made to Ontario ABCs and found only 1.46% are of Chinese descent. Chinese Canadians represent much higher in Toronto ABCs, even though they're still proportionally underrepresented compared to their population. Chinese Canadian women represent slightly higher than men in this sector. So finally, let's take a look at the elected office. We looked at the school board trustees, municipal councillors, MPPs and MPs, and found that Chinese Canadians represent highest in the elected office compared with all other sectors. Women represent lower than men in 3 out of the 4 subsectors in this sector. So in summary, Chinese Canadians are severely underrepresented in all 8 sectors, especially in the judicial sector, which is only 0.74%, and the corporate sector, which is 1.14%. And also we can see the difference in representation across sectors. Just as Dr. Sukir said, the problem is not about the pool of talents, it is about the organizational culture and strategies. Women represent lower than men in all sectors, except for the judicial sector. Their representation is extremely low in the public service sector, which is only 0.37%, and the corporate sector, which is 0.42%. It should also be noted that in the corporate, charitable, and education sectors, most Chinese Canadian women identified in Tier 1 leadership are board members, not senior executives. Actually, they are largely absent in executive management positions. So in terms of the pipeline leadership positions, we only examined the 3 sectors where data were available, including public service, judicial, and post-secondary education. As we can see from the chart, only 1.9% leaders are of Chinese descent. Chinese Canadian women represent much higher than men in Tier 2 leadership. They take up over 70% of the total number of Chinese Canadian leaders, which means Chinese Canadian men are severely underrepresented in Tier 2 leadership. In summary, the findings of our quantitative study confirmed the existence of the bamboo ceiling faced by the Chinese Canadians. For the rest of the presentation, Andy will share with you our findings of the interviews with 22 senior leaders. We hope the interview data could help us better understand the problem and broaden the discussion of the workplace EDI in Canada. I now pass this to Andy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. I saw a request in the question about captioning. My apologies, we didn't prepare for live captioning, so you would have to just listen to us, and maybe we should take that in mind next time to get this prepared. So let me share my screen and right. So you now have an idea from Kate's presentation that how low Chinese Canadian representation is. In the next few slides, I want to discuss some of the reasons behind those numbers and what could be done about it. In our research, we have identified 4 major barriers. The first one is a cultural complex. The second one is really racism. And the third reason is internalized racism. And the fourth one, a lack of mentorship support. There are 2 aspects of the cultural conflicts. The Chinese first came to Canada in 1788. There have been generations and generations of Chinese Canadians. But no matter how long they have been here, most of the Chinese Canadians have been influenced to different degrees by traditional Chinese culture. In the Chinese culture, respect for authority, being humble, make peace, keep harmony, avoid conflicts, work hard and don't complain, and be tolerant. And these are all very important values in the culture. And they should be good values for leaders too. But these are not values appreciated in the Canadian mainstream. In the Canadian workplace, self-promotion is important. And that's an antithesis of the Chinese values. So it's something that Chinese are taught to not do. So you have a lot of quietly competent Chinese Canadians not recognized or appreciated by their leaders. On the contrary, they are considered a lack of assertiveness. They are not leadership material. And this is really to the loss of both the individuals and the organization they work for. The other part of the cultural issue is the masculinized and westernized prototype of what leadership looks like. Our society is not really open to other types of leadership. The fact is, the masculinized and westernized leadership prototype is not the only type of leadership, and definitely not always the best type of leadership. There are quiet, respectful, contemplative, collaborative, and other style of leadership can be just as effective, but they're not yet accepted widely in this society. And the second barrier, racial bias and stereotypes. I'll give a few seconds to read that quote there. That story may be shocking to some of you, but it's not uncommon. We've heard it many times. Racism is not just a concept, it's hurting the lives and careers of countless people every day. David Suzuki once said, as a Japanese Canadian, he had to be twice as good. Throughout this research, we have heard many versions of that statement. Chinese Canadians have to meet a higher bar. They have to work extra hard to prove their value. And for many, that is still not enough. If you ask any Chinese-born Canadian-born Chinese, chances are they have been on the receiving end of some comments like, oh, your English is good. How long have you been in Canada? Where are you from? If the answer is, I'm from Toronto or Manitoba, then they will be asked, where did you really come from? They can't answer that question. They were born in Canada, they never been to China, they don't even speak Chinese. Now, that question is not uncommon. And that behavior is called microaggression. What the message that being telegraphed is, you are a foreigner and you're not one of us. So when Chinese Canadians are regarded as perpetual foreigners, they are perpetual workers and never leaders. That's a reality many Chinese Canadians have to face till this day. For them to reach senior leadership, they have to not only break the glass ceiling, they have also to break a bamboo ceiling, and that is set there specifically for Asian Canadians. For them to reach executive leadership is very hard. To reach the top executive spot is practically impossible. The bamboo ceiling is the reason some Chinese Canadian leaders left their corporate jobs and started their own companies. Their success has proved again and again that Chinese Canadians can be excellent chairs and CEOs, but they would never have had the opportunity in their previous organizations. So the next barrier is internalized racism, and this is the saddest part of this research. Chinese Canadians recognize that there is racism and there is systemic barriers, but different people deal with it differently. Some accept the reality and cope with it. Others have bought into these racial stereotypes and made this stereotype their beliefs. They believe that Chinese are not good communicators, they cannot be leaders, and they totally give up their aspiration to become a leader, no matter how much potential they have. There are also some who have been influenced by the stereotypes, but still want to make progress in their careers. They have to deal with a constant internal struggle. Am I good enough? Am I a credible leader? Will people see me as a competent leader? Will people listen to me? And it's almost like they have been inflicted with what we call imposter syndrome. And it's another kind of reality that Chinese Canadians can live through. The result of racism, we have very few Chinese Canadian role models in the senior leadership ranks, and which makes it harder for others to see themselves up there. So it's become a vicious cycle. You have no role model. You have very few people who can see themselves up there. And then you continue to have a lack of role models. So it's a perpetual underrepresentation. And finally, the lack of mentorship. We heard again during the research how extremely important mentors are. And this is fairly straightforward. Without mentorship and sponsorship from the senior ranks, it's practically impossible for anyone to join the senior ranks. So mentorship is crucially important for any organization that is serious about racial equity at the senior level. The first thing they should do is really to build the diversity talent pipeline and identify racialized candidates, mentor them, grow them into senior leaders. And this, we believe, is the fastest way to fill the leadership gap. I want to talk a little about Chinese women. They are a triple disadvantaged group. They suffer from racial bias, gender bias, and also a centuries-old stereotype. And they are portrayed as submissive, passive, and obedient. In the minds of many Canadian leaders, the image of Chinese Canadian women are secretaries and servers. It has never occurred to many of them that they can also be competent leaders. If you ask a Chinese Canadian woman leader, chances are they have been mistaken as a secretary or a server by their fellow leaders, colleagues, and clients. And the frequency of that happening is fairly striking. So those are the barriers, the major barriers we have identified. Now, what can we do about it? And we have a few suggestions. To start with, there needs to be sufficient awareness and understanding. And as Wendy mentioned earlier, there is a well-established body of literature that shows again and again the many benefits of diversity. The business case has been made beyond doubt. When there is real diversity inclusion, there is measurable increase in employee engagement, productivity, attendance, retention, sales, and so on. So it's very good for the corporate bottom line. Then why not many organizations are embracing this? And the answer, we think, is a lack of awareness. Most leaders do not understand that diversity is not a burden of political correctness. Diversity is strength, it's power, it's competitiveness. It's not a trade-off with excellence, it is excellence. By this day and age, pretty much all large organizations in Canada have made EDI announcements and have EDI policies in place. However, if you examine these policies and practices, you'll find many of them are just perfunctory. They are done to be politically correct so they can check off some boxes. And that type of EDI strategy will not work. When you hire people only as tokens to meet a quota, not only will it not work, it actually hurts the people in the organization. So for EDI to work, it had to be a whole organizational approach, practicing every corner, every unit, every branch, and every level of the organization. And it had to be systemic, from internal practices to external relations, from recruitment to training to promotion. And it had to constantly examine policies and practice and identify those that are no longer acceptable and stop them. Now, to make all of this work, a genuine commitment from the top is indispensable. And let's face it, advancing EDI means change. And for many people, that's too much change. And there will be resistance and there will be pushback. So without a commitment from the CEO, from the board, from the chair, it will be very difficult to make these changes. And finally, the goal of all of this is really to cultivate an inclusive culture. Culture is a very powerful thing, and it's fundamental. Without EDI culture at the foundation, EDI policies and practice will not be stable. They may not even survive. When you have an EDI culture, people of all backgrounds feel respected, relaxed, they can be their authentic self, they can celebrate their heritage, and they are more engaged, they are more motivated to contribute more ideas and are hopeful to become a leader one day. And they are happier, they produce more, and they stay longer, and they make happier customers. So you have all these benefits. And the power that can be unleashed by EDI is really significant. So it's really a shame that not more organization leaders are embracing this. In this slide, I'll talk a little about the role of government. Governments have important roles to play. They can enact legislation, set policies, and to set targets, require compliance, and they can regulate practices. Governments can require school boards to change their curricula, to teach the full history of Canada, not just the history of Europeans, but also the histories and contributions of Chinese, Asians, Blacks, Indigenous people, and all others. So that our students can leave school with a holistic idea of Canadian history and what it means to be Canadian. Governments can also shape public discourses and influence the public narrative, which can have far-reaching outcome in the long term. Now, one of the pleasant surprises in this research is how many times we heard from Chinese Canadian leaders mentioning the Trudeau cabinet. Remember in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced his gender-balanced cabinet. At the time, I think many Canadians didn't think much of it. However, it created a powerful narrative in the media with lasting influence. It started something that other political leaders cannot ignore and they have to measure up to. I think eventually it will become a new normal that's everywhere. And that would be a very good thing to have gender equity. And I want to read to you a comment by one of the leaders we interviewed. And the participant said about the Trudeau cabinet, it's just about picking excellent people and being very deliberate to pick the most excellent leaders you have. It shouldn't surprise us that 50% of them are women. Last but not least, government can be important behavior models as employers. Governments are usually the largest employers, and they can be the champion of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and they should be. Now that concludes my presentation, so we'll go to question and answers. If you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A, and you can type in any question you have, and we'll be happy to answer them. Let me see.
Yeah, I think we already have a number of questions here.
All right, so the first one I remember is about the caption. Sorry, we can't do that. There's a comment we're talking about the Chinese Canadian does need to include all intersecting identities as well. Yeah, we try to do that, and the Chinese and women. And
can I add a little bit more to this question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think this is a really important question, because we know these days we talk a lot about intersectionality, which means whenever we examine a certain group, we need to take into consideration all the identity factors, such as like gender, race, class, sexuality, physical ability. But for our study, because we collect all the quantitative data through the publicly available sources, so it would be very challenging for us to identify, all the identity factors. And also the focus of our study is to examine the systemic racism. When I was conducting the interview, I noticed that almost all the participants, in a certain sense, they are already privileged compared to the average Chinese Canadian, because they all have very good education, and most of them have very supported family. They have supported parents, but even for them, they have experienced this, systemic and individual racism. So I can assume the situation for the average people would be even worse. So I just want to add this to this question.
Thanks, Kate. So the next one, the underrepresentation is the result of less qualified candidates or systemic racism. I think Wendy, in her presentation, have already pointed out that you have different organizations have a very different percentage of racialized Canadians. And that means not the pool, we have a big enough of pool, it's the organization's policies and practice that make the difference. There are a lot of people that are just as qualified, if not qualified, in the Chinese community, in the Black community. It's just a matter of recognize, appreciate their different type of leadership and capabilities. Couldn't you have anything to add?
No, I think that's good.
So in the collection of the quantitative data for the various sectors, what is the time period applied? The time period held constant across all sectors? And Kayla, you want to take on that
one? Because we collected both quantitative and qualitative data. The quantitative data is, the collection was finished by the end of December 2020, because it is really a time-consuming task. And, we try to finish it as soon as we can, but still, it is, we are difficult to determine, it is the same period of time. That is one limitation of our study. I think maybe after the anti-Asian racism, the surge of anti-Asian racism, I noticed that in certain organizations, there has been changes in their leadership structure. There might be more representation of Chinese Canadians in certain organizations, but I don't think that the changes would be significant.
All right, so Next, what is the next step for CPAC Institute to do? We have a topic selection committee that have been meeting regularly. There are quite a few topics that we have been discussing, and we haven't made a decision on that yet, but we will continue with the research in the areas we have identified. The next one, how can I get a copy of the report? So everybody who have registered will receive a link to the full report. It's on our website, and you'll get this link very quickly. And if you can search the CPAC Institute on the publication section, you'll find it there now already. I feel another barrier that is missing has to do with punitive damages when a person is brave enough to come forward to seek legal redress. For example, the most damage for a Canadian Human Rights Commission discrimination case is $40K. Also, the process is less risky for a company or government with deep pockets. Kate, do you want to answer that one?
Maybe not now. Let me think a little bit.
Yeah, this is a little beyond our expertise because we are not legal scholars. We know something about EDI, we know something about racism, but in terms of punitive damages, it's more a question for human rights lawyers and the commission, I guess. So I guess that's about what we can answer to that question. But it's a good question. Mm-hmm. Will this presentation be shared broadly? Yes. We are sending out a release through the wire service fairly widely, and the report will be open to anybody to download and read on our website. And there is also a Chinese version of the news release. So we welcome anybody to read it, to share it, and feel free to show anyone. To be honest, the Chinese community itself is not even united enough, and the sense of competition is also part of the culture from East Asia. A common example that sometimes the Chinese don't like to refer their Chinese peers to their organization because they don't want to be surpassed by other Chinese. Could you address some initiative taken by CPAC at least to make Chinese professionals more united and help each other out? Wow, that's a very sharp question. I mean, at one time I was having a discussion with a Ontario minister who is Black. And he said, Andy, can you come to our Black community and do a presentation to tell us how you Chinese organize? You have strong organization, it seems united that you can accomplish a lot. And at another time, I was asked by an Arabic person about the same thing. He said, oh, our community is so united, and your Chinese community seems very strong and very powerful. So what I'm trying to say is every community has its own issues, but they are not the key issue. The issue within the community that we have people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, and other places have slightly different culture traditions, and I would not agree that all Chinese are like what you described. Maybe some of them are like that, but that's definitely not the bulk of the community. And I think this is something. Yes, it is an issue we should address, but I don't think this will affect the overall representation in mainstream and in leadership positions. Kate, anything else to add?
No.
All right. Dr. Sucre, do you have a comment for that?
Just that I would agree with you. You know, I'm most familiar maybe with the women's movement. And when I work on gender equity, I spend a lot of time pulling knives out of my back. So there's you know, one of the explanations is when people are marginalized or excluded, they're often fighting for relatively small pieces of pie. But I agree with the comment that trying to find ways to build bridges and work together. In fact, as you know, Andy, I feel that allies are really important, that, you know, I'm very happy to talk about issues of race and white privilege. I appreciate it when men talk about gender, and those kinds of alliances, I think, can be really powerful, because one of the challenges, and I can only say this as a woman, but I've been in senior leadership tables where I'm the only one, and, you know, I'm the gender police, and often people will dismiss your arguments as being self-interested. But if I talk about anti-Black racism or anti-Asian racism, people listen in a different way. And so trying to find ways not just to build alliances within specific communities, but across communities to advance diversity and inclusion, I think is very, very important.
Thank you. CPAC is part of a national coalition called Asian Communities Together to End Racism. We work with different communities, and I can see in the last year or so since George Floyd, there's a lot of allyship between different groups, the Blacks, the Indigenous, especially lately. You know, it's good to see people are working together in unison for a common good. This will really benefit everybody, every community. So it's a good thing we are doing that. Okay, next question. The Chinese culture has the value of being humble while it's a virtue, but it's also a curse in promoting individual advancement in politics and the business sector. The South Asians, I think, have done pretty well to become CEOs in many multinational corporations and financial institutions, and even in Canadian politics. Kate, do you want to answer that one?
Okay. Actually, a professor in the United States, they recently published a study. They examined, you know, they compare the East Asian and the South Asian Americans, and they find that because East Asian people are usually considered to be lack of the assertiveness, so they're less likely to be promoted to senior leadership. And that study actually pointed to the significance of diversifying the leadership prototypes. Being humble is not necessarily a bad thing in terms of leadership, because somebody can be a quiet leader as well. I remember when I talked to one participant and she said, I am a quiet leader. And I think there are a lot of strengths I brought to the table, you know, with my cultural background. The problem is not about being humble. It is about the stereotypes.
Yeah, the study Kate mentioned is done by MIT professor. His name is Lu, L-U, if you want to look at that report. Yeah, great. So what is the president or chairman of CPAC Institute? Who are the fund? Oops, that's, all right, you can send us an email for that information. It's not, that won't add much value to the discussion here. Thank you all for the great presentation. I would like to suggest to publish those data before you release them to the public. The publication in journal or newspaper will create more meaningful results. Thank you very much. I think it's too late. We already released the report on the website, but we do have plans to publish another version of some of the findings in the study, and hopefully that will get published. And we are also applying to attend a conference for a presentation for the research. And that's the end of the question. Oops, there's another one. A question for Dr. Silk here. How often should this research be refreshed so that we can see the trend is up or down? All right.
I think it's a really good point. I mean, we've been collecting data on racialized people and women now since 2008. So we can definitely see the trends. We have not disaggregated the data, until last year when we pulled out those who identified as Black. But the broader point for me is that without data, without accountability, and without transparency, people, to Andy's earlier point, you can make all the proclamations you want, and you can celebrate Chinese New Year and show up at a community event, etc. But to really make progress, in my view, requires the numbers and tracking. And I'm sure that one of the things that could be really helpful is starting to be more specific about which companies are doing a good job and which organizations are not doing a good job, and whether the focus is just on the representation of women or racialized people generally or Chinese people specifically. There is still a lot of what I would call corporate zeros that have no representation. And we need to call those companies out, and we need to celebrate the companies that are actually making progress. So the numbers and the tracking, in my view, is very, very important.
Thank you. I think in the report we wrote, advancing EDI is a journey, not a sprint. It's going to take time. It's going to take efforts from academics, from government, from leaders. But I'm glad that we are talking about this now, and the things are happening, which is good. And I think the diversity reports are a fantastic catalyst for this progress. They put this issue on the agenda of the corporate and political world. So, do you have any final thoughts maybe you want to share?
Just that I think it's an amazingly important study. And what I really appreciate, really appreciate, is that you surface the issue about leadership and stereotypes of leadership and what leaders should be. Because in my own experience, in my own institution, I've seen evidence of exactly what you describe, where someone who is very accomplished is also very humble, and someone who is not so accomplished is a braggart. But our culture rewards people who sell themselves, even if there's no substance. And I think that the challenge for that is not to change the behavior of the people who are humble, but rather to change the stereotype and the understanding of what a leader is and what makes a leader successful.
Well said. Thank you. Kit, do you have any final thought?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much for everyone for taking the time to attend this. And thank you to you, Wendy, for taking the time to add this context and additional information. We really appreciate your support and presence here. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye. We look forward to seeing you again.